You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
As I have conceded before, many believers in Judeo-Christian traditions view their scriptures as symbolic rather than literal. Mainstream Judaism emphasizes interpretation and a metaphorical understanding of the Hebrew Bible, just as the largest Christian group, Catholics, asserts that while the Bible was inspired by God, passages in it are symbolic and allegorical and not to be understood literally, especially when doing so contradicts history and science. In fact, according to a recent Gallup poll, the percentage of Americans who take a purely literalist view of scriptures has steadily fallen since the 80s. But there is a purpose in focusing on the claims of literalists in critiques of religious thought, since the number of literalists in America is still high, at 20%. Since the literalist view causes so much harm in promoting dogmatism and undermining education and trust in academia, journalism, and science. And since, as I've argued many times before, the authoritarian emergency America currently finds itself in is because of the marriage of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, which broadly takes the literalist view, with conservative politics since the 80s. But of course, literalist views of the Bible have a long history of leading people to believe and pursue the wrong things. And literalist views of the book of Genesis alone prove this. Belief in the descent of man from Adam and Eve has led to resistance against the science of evolution, as well as insidious racialist lies. Belief in the existence of the Garden of Eden in part drove the explorer Christopher Columbus in his travels, leading inevitably to all the evils of colonialism in the Americas. Belief in the story of the Nephilim has led to much folklore about giants, as well as many modern conspiracy narratives, as I discussed in my series on giants, No Bones About It. Belief in the literal truth of flood narratives has led to rejection of the geologic timescale, as well as a great many other false beliefs and a lot of other pseudo-archaeology, as I talked about in my episode on the Deluge and the Ark Seekers. The list of false ideas arising from literalist views of Genesis goes on and on. Among them are certain notions from the story of the Tower of Babel. You know the one, about the peoples of the world all working together to build a monumental structure that was an affront to God, who confused the languages of humanity in order to foil their plans. Literalists place the tower somewhere in Mesopotamia, in the kingdom of Nimrod, and point, as they often do, to an account in Josephus as independent verification of the historicity of the event, even though Josephus was just repeating folklore. Real history and mythology both provide ample possible inspirations for this story. For example, in the Sumerian flood narrative, it's said that the languages of the peoples were once unified before the intervention of the gods. And another Sumerian legend told of a great ziggurat being built, during which construction the gods were called upon to restore the unified language of mankind. Another rational theory put forward by none other than Isaac Asimov suggests that during their Babylonian captivity, Jews saw a certain unfinished ziggurat in the city of Babylon called Atamananki, and because the original Akkadian name of the city, Babalim, was reminiscent of the Hebrew word balal, which meant to confuse, they were inspired to make the story up. But literalists will have none of this. They believe the story really happened, and therefore they must believe that before the confusion of languages, humanity spoke one common language. The question of what this language was goes far deeper than you might think. It was commonly called Adamic, on the supposition that it was the language invented by Adam when he named the flora and fauna of creation. But some speculated that it was the divine language spoken by God in the act of creation. In the Middle Ages, Dante Alighieri did controversially point out that the first actual verbal exchange recorded in Genesis is between Eve and the serpent. But since that would make the language rather more Eve-ish than Adamic, or rather more diabolical than divine, he and everyone else simply rejected this as meaningless. Ever since early Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo suggested that the first language may have been preserved after the confusion of languages, many languages have been put forth as candidates for Adamic, the first or divine language, with the most prominent contender being Hebrew, for rather obvious reasons, since the entire notion came from Hebrew traditions, but also because of how insightful or perfect its names for things are, a claim that would come to be doubted by skeptics, and especially by those who wanted to argue for another language being the first or divine language. Through the centuries, a great many languages were considered: Chinese, Egyptian, Phrygian, Etruscan, Asturian, Persian, Sanskrit, Syriac, Antwerpian Brabantic, Gaelic, Celtic, Bulgarian, Catalan, Basque, Swedish, French, and German. If you want the full story on this, check out friend of the show Mark Chrysler's episode of the Constant podcast called Babylon, in which he delves much further into the whole nonsense, including Elizabethan sorcerer John Dee's belief that the gibberish his swindler friend Edward Kelly had scribbled out was the real angelical language, and delve deeper with the following episode of The Constant, The Forbidden Experiment, when Mark tells about ill-conceived historical experiments that may or may not have actually been conducted to raise infants deprived of all language in order to see if they would spontaneously start speaking the original, true Adamic language. Mark explores the whole topic far better than I might. And really, the Tower of Babel and the Adamic language isn't even the topic of this 2026 season premiere of the podcast. No bait and switch was intended. Really, I only stumbled onto the topic of Adamic as I sorted through the many pseudo-archaeological and pseudo-historical ideas present in the latest Indiana Jones story. This one, a video game. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I have found that even though the Indiana Jones franchise is fantasy adventure, which would be silly to take seriously, it promotes and disseminates many of the biblical literalist claims and pseudo-archaeological notions that thrive today in conspiracist media. Thank you for listening to Historical Blindness and The Great Alignment Lie. Before we start the episode, I want to thank my newest patrons. Thank you, Casper and Donna Fisher. And special thanks to generous new partner patron, AJ. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on the Satanic Panic, I produced a lengthy supplemental episode all about further panics within the Satanic Panic, many related to media, like the backmasking panic and the panic over cartoons and toys, comparing them to other panics related to the consuming of media by young people throughout history. And while the podcast has been on hiatus, I have produced and released 2 further supersized exclusives, both on foundational myths of QAnon belief that arose out of the Satanic Panic, the stories of the Finders Cult and the Franklin Cover-Up. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. New listeners may be unaware that back in 2023, I undertook to explore and debunk many of the ideas in the Indiana Jones franchise. Mostly I focused on the MacGuffins, first with the whereabouts of the Lost Ark of the Covenant and the quest for the truth of the Holy Grail. I very quickly realized, however, that my series would need to move beyond MacGuffins into the pseudo-historical ideas promoted in these films, as I did with my episode on the myth of the Thuggee cult, deconstructing the Temple of Doom's portrayal of the notorious Thuggee highway killers. As I began to look at newer indie films, I found they tended to combine more than one myth that needed deep examination. So I produced 2 episodes on the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. The first, The Search for Cities of Gold, examining the myth of El Dorado that drove so much exploration and colonialism in the Americas. And the second, The Forging of the Crystal Skulls, all about the total fraud that is presented in that movie like it's a genuine archaeological find. All of this was done leading up to the release of the most recent film, The Dial of Destiny, and again, I had a hard time parsing all the pseudo-history and myth in that film. I'd already done an episode on the Spear of Destiny, called The Thrust of the Holy Lance of Longinus, so I could ignore the brief cameo of that fraudulent artifact in the film's prologue. I ended up focusing my episode on the hunt for lost Nazi gold trains. But the following year, as part of my series on ancient high technology, I revisited all the claims about the Antikythera mechanism and the inventions of Archimedes made in the film. While this was not a full episode devoted to an entry in the Indiana Jones franchise, I did suggest the series may not be over because the video game Indiana Jones and the Great Circle would soon be released, and I might find further material to explore in it. Now, having played the game, I do find I have enough for another entry. First of all, I want to say, as I've said before, I love the Indiana Jones films. Even if they do amplify pseudo-history, they also inspire interest in history and archaeology. I credit them with some of my own interest in historical mysteries since a young age. The problem is when grifters and conspiracists take the myths and legends, the pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology of the films, and promote it as real, going on Joe Rogan and convincing many that real historians and archaeologists are lying. As for the story in this video game, I loved it too. Honestly, it may be the best entry in the Indiana Jones franchise since the 80s. I would highly recommend it to indie fans just for its cinematic storytelling, even if its gameplay is a bit clunky and frustrating. But like other recent entries in the franchise, it combines a variety of myths and legends in its story, making it difficult for me to parse for the podcast. First, it involved giants, part of a secret Catholic order called the Nephilim, and I can't focus an episode on that since I've already talked about it in detail in my series on giants, once again called No Bones About It. These giants in the game use a language that Indy recognizes as Adamic, and honestly, I probably could have stretched that topic into an episode or 2, but the Constant already did it so well, I'd just as soon point listeners to his treatment of the topic, so I thought it would work well as my cold open. Sorry to spoil this element of the game, but I'll be vague. At one point, it involves Noah's Ark and its supposed resting place on Mount Ararat. And again, I've talked about that a great deal in my episode, The Deluge and the Ark Seekers. What's left is the central conceit, the titular quote-unquote Great Circle, the idea that ancient ruins or sacred sites, the pyramids of Giza, the Nazca Lines, Easter Island, etc., are all mystically aligned along a straight path, a great circle encompassing the globe. It turns out there is a great deal to talk about regarding this pseudo-archaeological conspiracy claim. First and foremost, it must be acknowledged that great circles are very real concepts in spherical geometry. It is essentially like a straight line around a sphere, encircling and creating a cross-section of the sphere. What makes it a quote-unquote great circle, as opposed to the many smaller circles one could make by encircling a globe, is that the plane it delineates would pass through the center of the sphere, such that when a great circle passes through any one point, it must also pass through its antipodal point, the point on the exact opposite of the globe. As a simple example, the Earth's equator is a great circle, while the Arctic Circle is not. This concept is important for the measurement of distance and the navigation of the shortest path between 2 points as an airplane flies. In typical Euclidean geometry, everyone knows the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But on a sphere, or on an oblate spheroid, as Isaac Newton demonstrated the Earth actually is, resembling more of a slightly squashed ball than a perfect globe, a straight line between 2 points would have to pass through the surface. Therefore, the shortest path between 2 points on a globe is a geodesic line, an arc segment on a great circle intersecting both points. Therefore, in the Indiana Jones films, when the red lines of Indy's airplane flights are shown taking an arrow-straight path across a flat map, it is not really accurate. Only in the most recent film, The Dial of Destiny, when that red line is shown weaving its way from Casablanca to Athens, is an accurate great circle route depicted, following the curvature of the Earth. All this to say that there is nothing fringe or conspiracist about the idea of a great circle. The dubious pseudo-archaeological idea is that major ancient sites were built to align with other such sites on the same geodesic path. And it seems that this notion was taken by the writers of the video game from an array of conspiracist claims that grew out of the Earth Mysteries movement of the 1960s, a range of New Age beliefs in the spiritual energies associated with sacred sites that arose alongside neo-pagan religions like Wicca and modern ufology, and whose connection to those other dubious movements should be considered when examining its credibility. The exact claims of the game can be found in the work of Jim Allison, as published on notorious pseudo-archaeologist Graham Hancock's website in the early 2000s, suggesting a global alignment of the Great Pyramids, Easter Island, and Machu Picchu as part of a larger speculation about the location of Atlantis. Tracking down Allison's claims to a website that looks like it was built in the early days of the internet, we can see that he took great inspiration from Hancock, as well as from Hancock's erstwhile partner, Robert Bauval, who together popularized claims about the astronomical alignments of the pyramids, claims I refuted in detail in my 6-part series, Pyramidiacy, back in the summer of 2024. Indeed, Jim Allison's bibliography of links, most of which are broken or lead to harmful websites, but the content of which can be discerned from the names mentioned in their hypertext, reads like a who's who of long-refuted pseudo-archaeological nonsense. Besides Hancock and Bauval, he cites the work of Karl Munk, the father of the code, the notion that the builders of ancient monuments embedded some sort of encrypted message within the dimensions of the structures, messages that can only be decoded using numerology, like gematria. I've spoken about numerology in detail as well in my episode on Pythagoras, All is Number, and I've refuted the significance of messages derived by gematria on numerous occasions, when talking about 666, the number of the beast, the Bible code, and the theories about Shakespearean authorship. To give a brief debunking here, Monk claimed that he could decode latitudes and longitudes by cherry-picking numbers from certain measurements, even though the notion of grid lines on world maps was not developed until Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BCE, thousands of years after some of the sites he studied in developing his quote-unquote archaeocryptography. It has been pointed out that by arbitrarily choosing a prime meridian and measurements to suit the coordinates he wanted to find, Monk could quote-unquote decode any latitude and longitude he wanted to. Also in his bibliography of links, Jim Allison refers readers to the work of Heinz Kaminsky, who claimed to discover that Stonehenge aligned with other megaliths to create a grid system. In a patron exclusive called Stonehenge Unhinged, I spoke in detail about issues with Stonehenge alignment claims, but I think it suffices to point out that in his work on megalithic alignment theories, Kaminsky cited self-proclaimed clairvoyant quack Edgar Cayce and theosophist crank Rudolf Steiner in his efforts to prove the existence and location of Atlantis. Kaminsky was also known for perpetrating hoaxes and false claims, having claimed to have intercepted on his self-made radio receiver at home secret space transmissions from undeclared Russian space flights, helping to launch the long-lived conspiracy claims that cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space, and that there had been, quote, phantom cosmonauts, end quote. Before continuing to trace the provenance of the claims about Great Circle alignment, it is important first to demonstrate that it's just not true, no matter how intriguing and cool an idea it is for a fantasy story. First, Allison's ideas appear to have been taken almost entirely from a little-known book privately published in the 90s called Global Sacred Alignments by Terry Walsh. Jim Allison may focus on one particular Great Circle alignment of ancient sites, but Walsh delineates many of them, showing how one can draw a geodesic path connecting, for example, Easter Island with a great many different ancient sites. Rather than recognizing that this demonstrates how very unremarkable such alignments may be, Allison and Walsh marvel at the sheer number of these alignments, as if it further proves the intentionality of the alignments, rather than their randomness. They even share small circle alignments, showing how they can align sites in a circle that may not be geodesic, but rather equidistant from an axis point of their choosing, disregarding the fact that they choose unremarkable axis points, even sometimes in the middle of an ocean, just to get their circles to line up. Then there's the further issue of precision. They act like this was some precise geometric science, demonstrating advanced land surveying capabilities and global navigation knowledge among ancient cultures. But on their maps, the dots representing aligned sites are sometimes the size of small countries, able to include any site in that area. Allison at least includes a column of data indicating the actual distance between the aligned sites in question and the exact Great Circle he says connects them. And it is quite a variation, with some of the locations being as far as 40 miles from the Great Circle with which they were supposedly built to align. A further problem with their whole idea is that the monuments and structures that supposedly line up on the Great Circle were built by very different, unrelated cultures, living in vastly different periods and removed from each other by thousands of miles of ocean. To believe that this alignment was intended, we would have to believe that some plan or great design was transmitted from the Egyptian people responsible for the construction of the pyramids to the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island 1,000 years later and 10,000 miles away, and 1,000 years after that to the Nazca people, etc. And yet, no record of this cultural connection or dispersion exists, let alone proof of any intention to build these structures according to the alignment proposed. Of course, the temptation is to claim these sites are actually older, built by some mysterious global predecessor culture, like Atlantis or aliens. But we actually know a great deal about many of the ancient structures identified as part of the Great Circle. For example, one location that Allison and Walsh place on their circle is the ruins of the first Siamese capital at Sukhothai in Thailand, a palace and numerous Buddhist temples that we know were built in the 13th century, only about 700 years ago. Not at all that long ago by comparison with the other sites on the Great Circle. To illustrate how ridiculous it is to claim this was built purposely to align with the Great Circle, it would be like arguing that Notre Dame was built to align with the pyramids and Easter Island. Both the ruins at Sukhothai and Notre Dame Cathedral were built in the 13th century, but Sukhothai, being more exotic to Allison and Walsh, seemed like maybe it could be part of this ancient conspiracy. Because remember, at the heart of most pseudo-archaeological conspiracies is the racist claim that native peoples did not build marvels, but rather some mysterious precursor race did. And that is not a claim typically made about European marvels. The simple fact is that all these sites, constructed by vastly different peoples in vastly different places and time periods, had only one thing in common: the Goldilocks zone. A Goldilocks zone is the scientific concept that where the conditions of a region are quote-unquote just right for a phenomenon, that phenomenon is more likely to occur. The Great Circle that Walsh and Allison highlight dips only 13 degrees south of the equator, and therefore, on the other side of the globe, reaches as high as 30 degrees north, making the majority of its circle fall within the most habitable region of the planet, where the most ancient civilizations existed. This Goldilocks zone is temperate and fertile enough, with enough fresh water and rainfall, that the development of agriculture was possible, and thus large-scale civilizations. It is not surprising, therefore, that if one draws a great circle through those regions, one can draw their line through several of the many monumental structures that such civilizations build, provided, of course, they leave out the rest that they can't manage to line up. Now for a brief intermission. Now, back to the show. Jim Allison also links to material by British esotericist John Mitchell, and this gives a sense of the true origin of both his and Walsh's claims about global sacred alignments as having grown out of the Earth Mysteries movement, and specifically its claims about ley lines. The concept of ley lines goes back to the 1920s, when amateur archaeologist Alfred Watkins came up with the name, but it was an idea that went back much further in time. The concept is similar in some ways to the spirit roads or sacred ways of the Chinese, who lined the paths to tombs with ornate statuary, and the corpse roads or church ways linking burial places in Europe. that will-o'-the-wisps or corpse candles were thought to haunt. It's related in some ways also to the fairy paths of European folklore, thought to be the paths traveled by fairies who would punish those who blocked them, such as by causing illness in homes thought to be built on their pathways. One direct predecessor of Alfred Watkins' ley lines notion, though there is no evidence that he drew on the work, is Joseph Houghton Spencer's Monk's Walks, his idea that pathways linking monasteries had existed since pre-Christian times. Spencer imagined that the garden pathways in Barton Grange in Taunton reflected some larger alignment that he attributed to some, quote, far-seeing engineers, end quote, when really a bird's-eye view of the garden he was exploring shows the paths were only designed to crisscross it from corner to corner, which was rather common of such 18th century gardens. Around the same time as Spencer was writing, Norman Lockyer was pioneering the pseudoscience of archaeoastronomy, arguing that Stonehenge and other megalithic sites in England had been built to align with the rising and setting sun on solstices. Alfred Watkins, a beer brewer by trade with an interest in beekeeping and a growing obsession with antiquarianism, combined these notions when imagining that ancient ruins in the English countryside were all arranged in straight lines. His conclusion was that these structures had been built along ancient trade routes, which connected cultural sites as well, such as burial mounds and stone circles. He called them ley lines, borrowing a suffix from many English place names in the area, such as Ambersley, Hursley, Munsley, Tupsley, Wormsley, etc. There was no other meaning to it than that, and Watkins viewed ley lines as practical, not mysterious artifacts, a simple old track representing the shortest distance between two places. He would have been aghast at the pseudoscientific ideas later attached to his theory. Even so, his theory too was rejected, or rather ignored, by experts of his day, mostly because he never offered any evidence for the antiquity and intentionality of his system of paths. Moreover, there were logic problems, such as that his ley lines would have been terrible paths indeed, striking right through forests and bogs, regardless of natural impediment. Also, the sites he linked by ley line served different functions: churches, crossroads, castles, and even just prominent features of the landscape, and many were from vastly different time periods, from the Neolithic to the Middle Ages, such that forging paths between them makes little sense. Finally, skeptics have proven that, much like the Great Circle claims that would later grow out of this idea, the straight lines created by linking sites were entirely random, excluding any landmarks that don't line up. In the 1950s, British archaeologist Richard Atkinson, known for his skepticism of Stonehenge being an ancient astronomical computer, proved that Alfred Watkins's ley lines were nothing more than coincidence by mapping out telephone box lays, straight lines that happened to align with the locations of public phone booths. Although the notion of ley lines didn't catch on in the scholarly community, Watkins's ideas drew the interest of fellow amateur enthusiasts like himself, with hobbyists forming a club, the Straight Track Club, for whom Watkins eventually published The Ley Hunter's Manual, a handbook for searching out ley lines. Again though, these were at the time only considered intentional alignments of landmarks, remarkable in that they indicated advanced land surveying capabilities in the ancient past, but not supernatural at all. A mystical view of ley lines only emerged some 26 years after Watkins' death, when the notion of ley lines had otherwise faded into relative obscurity. In 1961, a little booklet was printed called Skyways and Landmarks, written by a total unknown named Tony Wedd, in which, years before Erich von Däniken popularized such ideas, he theorized that the ley lines identified by Watkins and his ley hunter enthusiasts were actually a network of navigational guides for flying saucers. Wedd's theory did not spring from nothing, though. It was inspired by a French ufologist's theory, arising from a 1954 UFO flap. In the north of France, a man named Marius de Wilde claimed to have seen some strange beings boarding a landed, cigar-shaped UFO and then flying away. When the press publicized the descriptions of his experience, numerous similar sightings of cigar-shaped UFOs were unsurprisingly reported, reflecting the media contagion effect so common in these flaps. French ufologist Aimé Michel thereafter compared some of these sightings and claimed that they aligned, forming straight lines, creating what he called orthotonies. In his book, Flying Saucers and the Straight Line Mystery, he suggests that these objects were plotting great circle routes, which of course many of these objects probably were if they were man-made aircraft, taking typical flight paths. In his pamphlet, Tony Wedd simply wedded, if you will, Michel's straight line mystery with the notion of ley lines, suggesting, in a bit of pure speculation, that flying saucers or cigars may be flying along these ley lines following some sort of unusual energy, like a quote-unquote magnetic current. With this pamphlet, the Earth Mysteries movement, with its belief in the earth energies of sacred landscapes and ancient magics understood and wielded by precursor civilizations, was born. It would be more widely popularized in 1967 by John Mitchell in his more widely read book, The Flying Saucer Vision, yet another work that beat Erich von Däniken to the punch with claims of ancient astronauts assisting in the building of ancient structures. As Mitchell further developed his ideas in the late 60s, he compared the energies supposedly inherent in ley lines to the quote-unquote dragon vein energies of Chinese geomancy, better known as feng shui. Perhaps unsurprisingly, since we see the same thing in the work of his contemporary von Däniken, Mitchell misrepresented facts to suit his purposes in his archaeological claims, and the entire basis of his theory, which became like a millenarian cult, predicting the coming of an age of Aquarius, was logically flawed. To claim ancient aliens actually established or built ley lines to harness Earth energies, ley lines would actually have to be a concrete thing that had been built or created. In reality, ley lines were nothing but a hypothetical path imagined in a game of connect the dots between sites that had nothing to do with each other, some having been built in the Neolithic or Bronze Age, some as recently as medieval times, and some not having been built at all, as they were just natural rock formations. Following the publication of Tony Wedd's pamphlet, the old Ley Hunters Club was revived, this time by UFO enthusiasts. For amateurs who had not been trained in the scientific method of archaeology, the fun outdoor excursions of ley hunting provided them with the feeling that they were discovering the mysteries of the past. In reality, they were mostly just playing connect the dots between churches, on the untested assumption that those churches had all been built atop some ancient sacred places. In 1965, Ley Hunter magazine began its publication, and the ley hunting community began to formalize their beliefs. Not all agreed. For example, there was a difference of opinion on whether ley lines were used to harness Earth energies or just to mark them. However, their views of the past did align, with most agreeing that ley lines were surveyed in the Neolithic period by an ancient British civilization that lived in greater spiritual harmony with nature. Some sought to reconcile their beliefs with establishment science and archaeology, touting the work of a few more respectable archaeoastronomers as being supportive of their views, and suggesting that the extremely low-frequency electrical current known to flow through the Earth's crust and mantle, known as telluric current, is the Earth energy they claim is concentrated or harnessed in and around their ley lines. However, after Mitchell's work, many ley hunters took on a more mystical bent in their beliefs, applying the numerology and gematria of archaeocryptography in their ley hunting, and claiming they could themselves harness and detect the Earth energies they sought through the use of divining rods, a practice known as dowsing. Also known as doodlebugging and water witching, the practice, which involved loosely holding a Y-shaped stick, or sometimes two metal wires, and walking around until the stick is, by some supposed Earth energies, mysteriously pulled downward or the wires crossed, thereby marking the optimal spot for well digging, or in this case, finding ley lines. The practice has been used by swindlers throughout history for treasure hunting scams and continues to be used by con men today. It is considered a pseudo-scientific practice, but to the more mystical ley hunters, it is proof of the presence of the Earth energies they seek. The gulf between these two factions in the ley hunting community, those who would like to legitimize their hobby as a genuine scientific field, and those who consider it a more arcane and therefore spiritual belief and pursuit, has only widened through the years. In 1977, the editor of Ley Hunter magazine launched a scientific experiment called Dragon Project, involving the testing of megalithic circles for radiation and sonic aberrations, but failed to produce significant findings demonstrating a pattern that might indicate the actual presence of unusual energies at these sites. Then in 1983, two archaeologists undertook a thorough examination of ley hunter claims and concluded that it was just statistically likely for any straight line in the region to pass through several of the sorts of sites ley hunters believed indicated the presence of a ley line. Eventually, the more scientific-minded of ley hunters began to lose their faith, and only the mystics persisted. In 1999, Ley Hunter magazine published its final issue, and its editor pronounced belief in ley lines, quote-unquote, dead. Listeners of Historical Blindness know, however, that belief in stupid and long-disproven nonsense never truly dies. More recently, the ley lines idea was repackaged by a writer named Tom Brooks, who claimed that ancient stone circles in Britain formed a grid of isosceles triangles rather than straight lines. Much like the debunking of ley lines using the location of phone booths, skeptics pointed out that you could just as easily create a grid of isosceles triangles using the locations of Woolworths stores. Around the same time, about 10 years after Ley Hunter ceased publication, the History Channel began airing Ancient Aliens and digging up every single piece of ufological bullshit they could find in their quest for continuing content. It did not take long at all for them to seize on ley lines and the idea of sacred places aligning according to unusual energy currents. They seem to have raised it first in Season 3.
But is it possible, as ancient astronaut theorists believe, that man was able to capture and use the Earth's energy at power centers around the world to help build their megalithic monuments?
Then it pops up again in Season 12.
Could it be that ancient structures throughout the world were designed to function together as part of a massive energy grid?
Then Season 13.
In recent years, a growing number of ancient astronaut theorists have suggested that not only did extraterrestrials influence our ancestors as to the precise positioning of important structures, but they did so in a way that was designed to tap into the Earth's natural energy.
And then in Season 14.
According to ancient astronaut theorists, natural formations and structures found at a latitude of 19.5 degrees form a kind of a pattern, what some refer to as cosmic geometry.
In 2022, they produced an entire special on the topic called Energy Lines and Hotspots.
Philosophers like Plato were very adamant that the ancient sacred places were specially positioned along the face of the earth in a very deliberate way, and they conformed to what was called a world grid. The temples were not placed haphazardly. They actually had a structure and purpose to them.
Always they claim that Plato first suggested this idea of a world grid.
In the 4th century BC, Greek philosopher and mathematician Plato taught that the basic structure of the Earth evolved from geometric shapes now known as platonic solids.
Plato wrote that there was a world soul, and this world soul he described as a sphere that was composed of 120 equal, identical triangles. I believed that that model actually could be applied to the Earth.
To illustrate Plato's sphere of triangles, anthropologist Beth Hakens designed a model of the Earth, divided by 15 circles.
See, they all go around whichever way you look. They're all great circles. It's a geometric model of the Earth energy grid of what Plato discovered 2,500 years ago.
And this is utter fabrication. Plato did envision the world of forms and geometric shapes as transcendent and foundational to our reality, but he didn't plot out some world grid or have anything to say about the locations of sacred sites aligning. But of course, this complete invention can be found all over the internet on paranormal and conspiracy web pages devoted to ley lines and great circle alignment. And beyond sensational television and conspiracist online media, there is the massively influential vector of podcasts. Within the last year, the biggest podcast in the world, The Joe Rogan Experience, which has a long track record of amplifying the pseudo-archaeological claims of Graham Hancock and his ilk, had YouTuber AJ Gentile on his podcast talking about all sorts of conspiracies and ufological nonsense, and ley lines were brought up as a theory potentially explaining crop circles.
So, ley lines. So this is the theory?
That's a theory. Have you heard about ley lines?
Kind of.
It's this alleged grid of energy that circles the Earth, and almost like how magnetic fields work. And these energy lines have intersection points, and on these intersection points are things like Stonehenge, Giza.
So ley lines. So these things are to differentiate areas so they could see them from the sky. Is that the idea?
The ley lines are the energy lines. Mm-hmm. A mystical energy. It's not a scientific energy. And where the lines intersect is where you see sites like Machu Picchu, Giza, Stonehenge, all these ancient sites.
Now, crop circles, which have famously been revealed to be hoaxes, but which some continue to believe in, claiming some are hoaxes but others aren't, are an entirely different topic that I won't get into here, except to say that ley lines can't be an explanation for them when ley lines themselves have been debunked. Gentile does make some effort to share a skeptical viewpoint, calling ley lines, quote, semi-debunkable, end quote.
But ley lines is, it's semi-debunkable because if you connect enough lines, you're going to find patterns. You're going to find geometry.
Right. You go looking for it.
Right.
Yeah. Just very weird stuff.
But as is always the case on Rogan, skeptical viewpoints are not given priority or emphasized nearly as much as the sensational and conspiracist ideas that earn him his massive download numbers. And this is the world we live in, the information landscape we have created. I'm sure that some may think it's not worthwhile to debunk an idea just because it's promoted in an Indiana Jones story. Certainly, that is fiction, and it would be silly to view its premise as anything but fantasy. But that's not how things work. I remember watching Raiders of the Lost Ark as a little boy raised in a fundamentalist evangelical household, and the idea that the Ark of the Covenant really could melt faces was entirely accepted as conforming to our biblical literalist view of reality. My wife, who is Indian, remembers being bullied for eating monkey brains because Temple of Doom depicted that as an Indian delicacy. And even though Grail legend is not even from the Bible, but rather originated in a work of medieval poetry, people nevertheless believe it is real. And the Indiana Jones franchise popularized the belief among many. In a world in which the subtle racism of hyper-diffusionist Atlantis seekers like Graham Hancock is magnified on the History Channel, in Netflix documentaries, and on the Joe Rogan Experience, I think it is worthwhile to talk about how this idea, the Great Alignment Lie, which has likewise been spread by those same channels of misinformation and has now been made extremely well known by an Indiana Jones video game that was played by more than 4 million people within a month of its release, has no actual basis in reality. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. I'm sorry I'm getting off to a slow start with this season premiere. I was traveling over the holiday and was unable to get a head start on all the work that had piled up. I still hope to catch up on some patron fulfillment soon and to settle into a regular release schedule after this premiere. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, never underestimate what people will believe. As I've shown, there are people out there in the world who believe nearly every plot point in the Indiana Jones franchise to be real, genuine history.